And so it begins, a brand new championship in Lucas Oil Pro Motocross starting this weekend at Hangtown. Get your tickets now. Download the NBC Sports Gold app and pay the money to watch the races, or watch it on NBC Sports and MAV TV in your television set. This will be the 50th anniversary of Hangtown. I'm honored. I'm Jason Wygant, by the way. I get to do the play-by-play television announcing starting this weekend, my 12 weekends of glory for the year. And I know you all want to talk Hangtown 2018. You all want to look into the very near future, the next couple of days when we go racing, and it's all about Anderson and Tomac and Muscan and other riders who I'm not mentioning right now. That's going to get people really mad that I'm not mentioning them. Yes, Ken Roxon is racing Hangtown. And I wanted to get Davey Coombs on the phone because, full disclosure, if you don't already know this, Davey Coombs runs Racer X. Davey Coombs is the president of MX Sports Pro Racing, which operates the Lucas Oil Pro Motocross Championship. But you almost cannot have a conversation about the present or the future with Davey without him getting all amped up on the past. He is the motocross historian of the highest order. And for the last 10 days or so, he has been throwing himself into this project of how did the AMA Motocross Nationals actually begin. Now, that seems like a very easy thing. It's like the AMA just started hosting a National Motocross Championship, and boom, there it was. But it's much more complicated and much humbler than that. And the real jumping off point is 1972. That's the year that they start what is known as the AMA Nationals. Oh, but they are nothing like what Lucas Oil Pro Motocross and the AMA Nationals are now. And by the way, 72, a huge year, because not only do the Nationals begin in a very humble fashion, that's also the year that Supercross as we know it is essentially invented with the Superbowl of Motocross held inside the LA Coliseum. And at that time, that actually kind of sort of counted in the AMA Nationals, which consisted of multiple series all combined into different championships, but also one championship in total, 25 rounds. So you think things are confusing now with having motocross and supercross championships in the same year? You're not going to have any clue what's going on in this first year in 72. And by the way, this year we're celebrating 50 years of Hangtown, so obviously Hangtown far outstrips the actual history of this championship. It goes back further than that. And yes, Hangtown historians now will say, but that's not the same track. Yes, we know. The first Hangtown track was in Plymouth, California. They moved. They kept the name. That counts. It's still 50 years of Hangtown, which was not even a part of any of this at that time. It was running its own big one-off races, the Hangtown Classic, of which the National is still known. So we're about to get Davey on the phone and ask him about these very humble roots for motocross in the United States and how this championship came to be. But first, a sound sweeter than bikes thundering fourth gear around a motocross track, which will be coming up this Saturday. Here's something even better. Podcast. Oh yeah, so good. So Hangtown's coming, Davey's coming, but I must mention our sponsor. You want to talk history? How about talking 63 years of four-stroke research and development with Yoshimura? They've got everything you need as far as exhaust systems for your dirt bike, your street bike, your ATV. The Stopwatch Nationals have been going on in California for the last week and a half. I'm just going to throw it out there. I think our Yoshimura-equipped rider won. Christian Craig looking so good, going so fast. There you go, flying at the test track. Dual Yoshimura mufflers popping out of the back of that factory Honda. So congratulations, Christian Craig. This is in no way scientific or based on any results at all. I'm sure he looked the best because his style is awesome. And he's got those sweet pipes. Get him at yoshimura-rd.com. Also, check out racerxbrand.com. That's where we've got all our RacerX clothing. We've got hats, shirts, and a whole bunch of other stuff. I love the 1989-ish Damon Bradshaw High Point t-shirt we just came out with. I'm wearing one right now. Just have to trust me on that. And we've got a lot more of those late 80s, early 90s themed things coming your way real soon. So keep checking out RacerXbrand.com and also subscribe to RacerX. That's ultimately what's paying the bills and keeping the lights on in this studio, which is actually my house. It's our little secret. Anyway, into the way, way back machine with Davey Coombs. Yeah, I would love to talk what's coming up on Saturday at Hangtown. He just wants to talk old school. That's the way his mind works. So here's Davey on how the AMA Nationals began, and I think it's pretty shocking compared to what you think. Yes, even Evel Knievel is involved. Seriously. Davey?
Well, I grew up in motocross, so I kind of live in the past sometimes. Oh. But no, I was an English major and a history major in college, and that has zero to do with motocross. But what it does do is it built an interest in me in sort of the history of the sport, and having the position we have, not only with RacerX Illustrated, but with our sister company, which runs the Nationals at MX Sports. I found myself recently going back and kind of trying to figure out the roots of the very beginning of Lucas Oil Pro Motocross, which obviously wasn't called Lucas Oil until they became a sponsor about a decade ago, but just the AMA National Motocross Championship. And while the series kicks off in 1972, that's not the beginning of pro motocross, as you know.
No, and what's interesting, you and I talked about this on the phone quite a bit here, especially last week. I think the general assumption that people would have is the Nationals have always been it. It's the national championship. So for American motocross, that's always been the hub of it, at least for motocross in the United States. But apparently, its beginnings were a lot more humble than people realized. It wasn't even necessarily the premier series, even though it did have that tag national championship on it. That's to me what's surprising about this whole process.
Well, the hindsight is 20/20, and we can look back now and sort of see what was there. And I'll admit I worked very thoroughly through the Cycle News archives. I strongly recommend anyone who is a history buff on some of this stuff to get an online subscription to Cycle News' archives and just go back and dig through some of the stuff, because I found out things that I did not know. My parents hadn't even subscribed to Cycle News whenever all this really got going. I don't even think Cycle News existed, to be honest with you. But yeah, the roots of motocross as we know it, and Brian Steele did a story on this and actually went to England. It began in 1924, a thing called the Royal Scot Trial, and all they did was they didn't time the race. Instead, they just lined them up and said, whoever completes 2 laps first is the winner. And that was a totally different form of racing, and they started calling it scrambles. And it really caught on, especially over on the continent, where they were still sort of recovering from World War I. And they had all these crazy landscapes that were built out of bombing, battlefields of World War I. And they started racing across them, and typical French fashion, they took the word scrambles, gave it their own name, and it became motocross. And they did that right up until World War II started, but just sort of at a European level. And finally, in 1952, the first professional world championship begins for 500cc motorcycles and 250cc motorcycles. We'll start up 5 years later in 1957. And meantime, here in America, all we've got is like Harleys and the Wild Ones and Marlon Brando, and there were a few pioneers like the Eakins brothers and Joe Bolger and Joe Vincent and guys like that, but never really anything that was pulled together to the point where you'd say, hey, that's a series. And of course that would all change in 1966.
If there's anything that illustrates, we say that now we live in a very small world where people can send each other texts and videos immediately to any corner of the globe. If there's anything that illustrates how big the world was in those days, that blows my mind to know that the World Motocross Championship starts in 1952, and 10 years later, we don't even really have it. Like, I guess I know NESC has been around. There were dirt bike races.
There were dirt bike races, and tracks like Pepperell, and even Ascot Park were doing things on the infield, and but they were still calling it scrambles. And it wasn't until a very smart motorcycle-driven entrepreneur named Edison Dye began selling motorcycles, and he came up with a eureka idea. In 1966, he became the importer for Husqvarna motorcycles, and he was having a hard time selling them because, you know, the funky name, even though the bikes were on top in Europe, people in America just weren't familiar with them, and he didn't really have anyone to showcase the bikes against the BSAs and the Harley Davidsons and the Triumphs and the Indians that people were riding. And yes, I'm talking about those big, you know, desert sleds and things that look sort of like a Scrambler Ducati now or a Triumph Bonneville. And all they would do is change the tires and adjust the suspension and go race them. And Edison Dye decided that if he got the right person on a Husqvarna and showed what it was capable of, that maybe he could sell more bikes. And that person was Torsten Hallman. Edison invites Torsten, the multi-time world champion from Sweden, over to do a couple exhibition races. And Torsten has a great time. Everyone's minds are blown. I think he laps everyone at the Hopetown GP, which is sort of an off-road race out in California. And Edison has that eureka moment. And the next year he decides to bring back several riders from Europe, and not only Swedish Husqvarna riders, but invites a kid from Belgium named Roger de Coster over to participate in what he's calling the Inter-Am series. And they take this series and they actually spread it around the country a little bit. They do races like Pepperell in Massachusetts and do some races in Elkhorn in Wisconsin and of course a few places around California. And the bikes start selling off the shelves. And suddenly, Edison Dye, motocross motorcycle importer, probably becomes the father of American motocross as we know it. Because as a sport, that's really where it starts, when Edison starts bringing European riders over.
So he imported the sport in order to sell more motorcycles. He basically imported
exactly.
the sport.
It was like if you wanted to break into, let's say, China and wanted to show them how to play basketball, you would send Michael Jordan over. And if you were a smart Chinese promoter who really knew how to press buttons, well, that's exactly what Torsten Hallman, or rather Edison Dye, did with Torsten Hallman. And while, you know, he was nowhere near as popular, you know, in the world as Michael Jordan would be today or even 30 years ago, what he was within motorcycle circles so well known and so much better than anyone riding the bikes in America that it was mind blowing. And so that's why, you know, Edison started bringing more and more people back. And as the sport grows, the Americans start to get a little better, but also the Europeans start to realize that there's easy pickings in America. You could go over on off weekends. Or maybe you had, you know, there's only 6 or 7 GPs a year at the time. And if a guy had some connections, whether you were a CZ rider or a Husqvarna rider or even a BSA rider like Jeff Smith from England, you could come over and make money, you know, basically giving motocross lessons to the Americans and showing off what your bike could do. And the spectators were eating it up because they'd never seen anyone ride bikes that fast.
Okay, so this first series then is the Inter-Am series, and that's a 250cc series, correct?
Yes, it's 250s only, and that was sort of where, you know, Edison was getting it done. And right when Edison decided that he should expand his Inter-Am series, he suddenly has a competitor, and that is in 1970 when the AMA, which has not sanctioned motocross up until that point, decides that they are going to sanction a series. And they're going to make it look just like Edison's series, which took place in the summer, only they're going to put it in the fall. They're going to make it 500cc motorcycles, and they decide to call it the Trans AMA series, or what, you know, we loose-handedly know as the Trans Ams.
Okay, so the kickoff for that one is in Ohio. That's the first Trans AMA race. So is that essentially the first AMA sanctioned motocross race?
It's the first AMA professional motocross race.
Okay, so
it's
they had
the
it
first,
maybe at the club level or something like that, kind of before.
Yeah, they had sportsman races, and they hold this race, and it started out with a little bit of disappointment because the big draw at that time, Joël Robert, was supposed to come and participate in this race, and he was a on and off again guy in the Edison Dye's Interim Series, but Robert was by this point had surpassed Torsten Hallman as the most famous rider in the world. Ironically, Hallman uses his experiences with Edison Dye to begin shipping motocross equipment over to the United States, and he starts a company that's basically Torsten Hallman off-road, what we now know today as Thor, but what in 1968 you could argue was the beginning of the aftermarket motorcycle industry in America.
The gear deal, the gear brands. That's the first.
The gear brands. And then, parts and whatnot. Things that you couldn't get. Torsten Hallman figured out, if I wear this and sell this, I could make some money. And he made a bunch.
Now, an interesting location pops up on this first Trans AMA race. The first one is in LaRue, Ohio, like we mentioned. Unadilla is the second round of that first ever 1970 Trans AMA series.
Yes, and Unadilla also was expecting Joël Robert to show up, and it didn't work out. He would be at the rest of the races, but the winner of those first two rounds was Jeff Smith, the former world champion from England, who would use these trips to America to establish himself with a brand, and actually went to work for Can-Am for a very long time. And then Jeff became influential later in life with the AMA and doing ARMA races and all that stuff like that. However, because Robert shows up late, wins all the races, has more points than anyone, they're still mad at him, so they don't let him claim the 1970 Trans Am Championship. And instead they declare the winner as someone who didn't actually win a race, but he just went to all of them, Dave Nickel. And you might recognize that name because his son is Kurt Nickel, who became very famous a generation later on as a Grand Prix racer and is still here in America working in the industry.
So does Dave Nickel, is he considered the national champion or no?
Well, this is where it has one of those funky little things that we used to do in the United States of America back then. Because there is no AMA National Championship, they decide that they will name the highest-ranking American as the national champion. And in 1970, the highest-ranking American finished fourth place. He was from Toledo, Ohio. He rode a Husqvarna, and his name was Dick Burleson.
Whoa.
The Dick Burleson. He would go on to become the 8-time AMA National Enduro Champion, but in 1970, he loaded up his van and followed the Trans AMA Motocross Series, and he's the de facto national champion for that year. And the same thing would happen in 1971 because in that series, the overall winner would be Sylvain Gabors, who is part of the very, very legendary Gabors family, who sadly just lost Eric last week. But Sylvain was a Suzuki teammate of Roger DeCoster's. The top American doesn't even finish in the top 10 in the standings, but it's Mark Blackwell on a Husqvarna, and Mark is considered the 1971 national champion. Just as in the Interams in 1971, they decided that someone named Jim Wicks, I believe, was no, I take it back, it was Gary Jones. Gary Jones was the national champion, even though he was the 7th place finisher. So you can see how this is all starting to get confusing because there's more and more series and more racers. But how do you say you're the national champion when you don't even finish in the top 10 in the series?
Yeah, and by the way, the Interam series, how does that get along with the AMA? They eventually do become an AMA series?
Well, they will have to because there are new competitors coming up, and Edison Dye, who's done incredibly well to this point with Husqvarna, starts to have problems with the brand, and he would end up, importing other brands. What I guess you could say is that the genie gets out of the bottle from him, and this thing that he started has proliferated, and now, there's a promoter in Florida named Bill West, who we're all very familiar with. Great guy. He started a company called Supersports and then became World Sports. Out in California, Stu Peters, who does, is there from day one, and maybe even before that, riding in California with the Eakins brothers and everything. He starts the CMC, which is the Continental Motorcycle Club that is producing races up and down the West Coast. Even Mike Goodwin gets involved. He's got a company called Leisure Tech, and he decides that he's going to have his own series, the U.S. Motocross Cup. So Edison Dye decides that what he's going to do is sort of manage what's his with the Interam series and not really try to block these other things, because he only has so much time, and you have to remember, he's really there to sell motorcycles. So whether it's his race or someone else's race, he's doing okay. They're riding motorcycles.
Okay, so that's basically 70 and 71, where a lot of this is going down, but you have pointed out several times to me that 72 is a huge linchpin year that links to all the things that are happening now. 72 is kind of the year where things are probably the most confusing and the most crazy. So explain the difference between 71 and 72.
It would be the difference between 1913 and 1914.
Oh.
In 1914, all hell breaks loose, and the world that we once knew changes because the collision between the Industrial Revolution and imperialism and Romantic Europe and all that stuff like that, whatever. World War I starts. The world is never the same. Well, in 1972, because the market in America is growing so rapidly, not only are European brands like Husqvarna, CZ, the German company Mako, all the Spanish brands like Bultaco, Montesa, Osa, they're all trying to get a foothold in America, but now here comes the Japanese. And they've already had success, Suzuki and Yamaha, over in Europe, and they decide that they're going to get serious about motocross in America. And so are Honda and Yamaha. I think I got them all four right there. Honda, Suzuki, Kawasaki, Yamaha. They all sort of come together in 1972 and decide that they're going to compete for the American market. The problem is, where are you going to do it? Because Yamaha is specializing in 250cc equipment at that point. Honda doesn't even have a motorcycle yet. Kawasaki decides to look at the open class market, and Suzuki, who is already heavily invested in Europe, they've won the 250 World Championship with Joël Robert and Sylvain Gabors. They've won the 500cc World Championship with Roger DeCoster. They don't really have a lot of money to spend in America in 1972, except to send DeCoster to the Trans Am Series in the fall. So you've got the Inter-Ams in the middle of summer, Trans Ams in the fall, and then you've got this Mike Goodwin series of 3 races in early spring, and then my favorite wild card of all, Evel Knievel.
Yes, literally your favorite wild card, just Evel himself. But he does have an involvement on the motocross side, which is bizarre, because I don't think of him as much of a motocross guy as far as motorcycling is concerned. But he has a significant part in this.
Yeah, and here's where it all starts to kind of pull together. Hangtown. The one place that has not been part of the Inter-Am Series, the Trans Am Series, or any other series is Hangtown. In 1972, and we're celebrating the 50th anniversary of Hangtown this year, but in 1972, Hangtown is not a national. In fact, it doesn't become a national until 1974. But it does become part of this 3-race series that Evel Knievel is going to put on, and it all is supposed to build into a crescendo where Evel Knievel is going to jump the Snake River Canyon. And Evel, who once upon a time was a scrambles racer and a dirt track rider, just not very good, decides that he's going to use motocross as the sort of the opening act to whatever it is that he does, but he's not ready to jump the canyon yet. So he does these other funny things like going up and down the West Coast and having events like a motocross race at Hangtown. It's not the Hangtown Classic. It's the week after the Hangtown Classic in 1972. The Hangtown Classic in 72 is won by Brad Lackey and Bob Grossi, a couple really fast Southern California, Northern California guys. And but it doesn't really count for anything. However, the next week, Evel shows up at the same track, says he's going to run it backwards, and he's going to give $6,000 away in the pro class. And let me read you what happens next in Cycle News. Okay. Evel, of course, is on hand to do 3 jumps Saturday and another one over rattlesnakes on Sunday. That's right, lions and rattlesnakes. Unfortunately, organized animal pals pressured Evel into leaving the mountain lions out of it after the famed showman joked on television that he was going to shoot them after he jumped them. Bad timing. Evel's broken collarbone was hurting him, and he was edgy all weekend. Of course, the large crowd loved the show despite several drunken hecklers. And you would have to accept that because Olympia Beer put up the $6,000 in prize money. Kudos to Evel's Cowcross, who put on a great show. It was one of the few motocrosses in America where you could cross the track when nobody was coming and still expect decent medical attention when you got hit. That's what Evel Knievel style motocross is like.
That is so evil. That is so 70s.
Yeah.
That is awesome.
So Evel is getting on the headlines over here. You've got, Mike Goodwin, already starting to talk about a Super Bowl of Motocross in Southern California. When the AMA decides that they are going to cobble together a bunch of promoters and start a standalone 1972 AMA National Motocross Championship Series. It will not include Unadilla, which runs a national to this day. It will not include Redbud, which is already in the business of running Trans Ams, and it won't include Hangtown, which is busy holding, the Hangtown Classic and races where Evel Knievel jumps over boxes of rattlesnakes afterwards. But the series will include, and this is where it gets kind of ironic, the first race will take place at Road Atlanta in April. It'll take place as part of what you would think of as sort of a bike week in Georgia. There's, AMA Pro Road Racing. There's going to be a dirt track race. And on the infield of Road Atlanta International Raceway, they build a motocross track, and they're going to have a national.
Okay. And that's the first one?
That's the first one.
Okay.
Now, here's the funny part. In the vault, and in every record book I have ever seen, it lists the date as April 16th, 1972. The winners of that race are Sonny DeFeo on a CZ in the 250 class and Barry Higgins. Good old Barry Higgins, the patron saint of DMXS radio.
Yeah, Barry Higgins. Yep.
He wins the 500 class, and he's also on a CZ. It's hard to find a lot of coverage of that event, but I do know that it actually took place on a Saturday. Oh. The only win ad I can find for it is from Goodyear Tires, and it says, Road Atlanta, April 15th, Sonny DeFeo wins AMA 250cc Moto-Cross on Goodyear's Eagle MX tire. It says, when the dust settled, Sonny DeFeo of Port Washington, New York, had the best point total for the 3 heats. 2 of them run on Goodyear's new Eagle MX.
Wait a minute.
So for some reason,
tire, all 3 motos?
he didn't run the tire in all 3, but 2 was good enough. Okay. Let's take 2. Okay. The race was also famous for, there was a lot of protests that weekend, and Gary Bailey, who was riding the 250 class, gets protested not for the Bultaco motorcycle he was riding, but because the full-face helmet he was wearing was not AMA approved. And a rider from Texas named Wyman Pretty protests Gary, and they make Gary wear an open-face helmet like everyone else. And Gary and Wyman Pretty almost get into a fist fight on the starting gate before one of the motos. That's good stuff. That's good stuff.
So if I have this right, the future of motocross is Goodyear tires, but not full-face helmets.
Not full-face. And 3 moto formats and on any Sunday. Only it started on a Saturday.
That's right. Yeah, so nothing new under the sun, as they say. We're back to Saturday anyway. So what we can clearly say is the beginning of the AMA National Motocross Championship, this is not the creme de la creme. This is not the premier deal in the United States. It might have the tag, the national championship on it, but the win ads aren't even calling it that. It's a pretty humble race, it sounds like, for the very first time.
It's a support race for a road race at this point. And, there's no Europeans there. They're all racing the World Championships. In fact, not even the best Americans are there, because ostensibly the best Americans, young Brad Lackey, young Jim Pomeroy, Jim and Jimmy Weinert, Gary Jones, they're all on the West Coast, and they don't even find it, worth the drive to come out to Georgia for this first race, nor do they go to the second race, which is somewhere right below Memphis at a place called DeSoto Motorsports Park. We don't see these guys, the guys that will win the series, until the third round. And the third round takes place in Sacramento. And again, it's not the Hangtown Classic. It's the Cal Expo Fairgrounds. And as you know, the California State Fair is, I think it's going on right now. They used to have a motocross race, and the promoter was Mike Goodwin.
Ooh.
And
so by the way,
this race takes
the
place.
Sacramento Mile? Is this where the flat track race
goes
on? Same place?
Yep.
Wow.
Same place.
Wow.
And unfortunately, this first race, which was May 13th and 14th, was, like the other races, something of a dust bowl. But they get it done. And then, but the problem is Mike Goodwin hasn't really decided to embrace the AMA. So he advertises his 3 races as the United States Cup Motocross Championships. And then in like a little font below that, it says AMA Nationals. And then the races are May 13th and 14th at the Cal Expo in Sacramento, May 20th and 21st, Saddleback Park, and May 27th and 28th at Carlsbad Raceway. So you do have Saddleback in at day one, and you have Carlsbad in at day one, although those racetracks won't, make it out of the 80s as far as holding nationals go. But that's when their name starts to get, really built as the real pillars of what we now know as American motocross.
So there's a full AMA national schedule, and then 3 of these races are kind of a series within a series. The Leisure Tech Mike Goodwin U.S. Motocross Cup, these 3 are within this group of what are considered AMA nationals. Is that what I'm getting?
Yes.
Gotcha.
Yes, they are. Now here's where it gets even more interesting. Goodwin has a 4th race scheduled, but he doesn't really know what to do with it because it is in the Los Angeles Coliseum. And this race will take place on July 8th. And he's going to do it under the lights. And, of course, you know where I'm going with this. It will be the Super Bowl of Motocross. And really what we know is the beginning of Supercross as we know it. No matter how you cut it, no matter what happened at Daytona and the infield, no matter what happened at Road Atlanta on the infield, no matter what happened at the Cal State Fairgrounds, the first person to turn out the lights, fill up a stadium with dirt, and have a race that we will identify a few years later as Supercross, it is Mike Goodwin. And he decides that this race will not be part of his own U.S. Motocross Cup. He will make it part of the Inter-Am Series instead. And he's going to give a $20,000 purse because he wants to match what Evel Knievel was giving away. Problem is, Evel was giving away, by this point, $25,000 at his next race. they get into sort of an argument, a public argument over who's going to have the most purse money, even though neither could really be depended on to pay that money. So right before the Super Bowl of Motocross happens on July 8th, Evel Knievel puts an ad in Cycle News and says that his 1973, this is a whole year ahead, Snake River Canyon Rattlesnake Mountain Lion Sky Cycle Spectacular will be worth $1 million.
Oh, come on.
Yeah, you got to think Austin Powers and the way Evel probably pitched this. $1 million.
You know,
and then when you read the fine,
these two personalities, you cannot get a better tank. This is like when we knew, hey, Carmichael and Stewart are eventually going to race each other at some point, and it is going to be nuts when they have to face off head to head. I don't know how many people listening to this are old enough to understand the personalities involved, but Mike Goodwin and Evel Knievel, you can't get two more swashbuckling, headstrong, boisterous, outspoken, and these guys are now battling each other.
They are, but you have to remember, Knievel is at the height of his popularity. He's got the toys, he's got the sponsors like Olympia Beer, he's got the TV shows. He's a regular on Johnny Carson and Dick Cavett and all that. I mean, every kid in America wants to be Evel Knievel because he's the epitome of danger. He's the epitome of cool. I once heard him described as a star-spangled charisma kleptomaniac in an Elvis jumpsuit. He was all that and more. Mike Goodwin was just getting ready to become that. But the difference is Knievel was a stuntman turned promoter. Goodwin is a promoter who turns himself into a stuntman and ultimately, becomes not more famous than Knievel, but they both become equally nefarious. I think that's a fair way to put it.
Yes, and what's incredible is, what are the AMA Nationals? I mean, they're a distant third to what these guys are doing.
The AMA Nationals, after Goodwin's third race, the one at Carlsbad, they do one more race, a standalone in Snyder Park, Indiana, of all places, and not everyone goes to it. Gary Jones goes, Gary Bailey goes, but Lackey and those guys don't go. They would rather stay in California. Now, here's where I got to tell you a quick Brad Lackey aside. Another place where the vault is wrong, and I now know this, but did not know this before. Brad Lackey did not race all year long on a CZ. Brad Lackey owned a CZ shop. Brad Lackey raced a CZ in the 250 class all over California, all over the West, because he was making a lot of money and he was selling motorcycles. But when Kawasaki came looking for a couple fast guys to shake down their prototype motorcycle, they picked Brad Lackey because Gary Jones was already wrapped up at the Yamaha, and they picked John DeSoto. And they would actually tell them that it didn't matter who would win the race or who would win the prize money, they would match it because they were riding prototype motorcycles that may or may not finish the race. And I'll give you a perfect example of this. May 28th, the Carlsbad U.S. Motocross Cup, or what we would call a national. This is how Cycle News described the race. The lead changed hands 24 times during the second 30-minute Open Pro Moto of the U.S. Motocross Cup at Carlsbad Raceway. And when the checkered flag came out, the lap counters were bewildered as to who won, Brad Lackey or John DeSoto. It was that close. Well, what do? Ask them? They did. And Brad and John looked at each other and smiled. Apparently Brad won it, but it didn't upset John. A pre-race, quote-unquote, agreement with Kawasaki took care of that. That, quote-unquote, agreement was that if both John and Brad, who were Kawasaki-mounted, got into the lead of any or all motos, the firm would make up the difference in the purse. And since the machines are prototypes, the factory didn't want to get the quote-unquote teammates to get into a really rough and tough hassle and destroy each other's chances. So there you have it, a national moto fixed by Kawasaki because they were on prototype motorcycles and they didn't want them banging into each other.
This is incredible.
The other funny thing about Lackey is he signed up as a CZ rider because he didn't want people to know that he was riding this Kawasaki. And whenever they got onto it, he decided to change the name of the bike he was riding to a CLD, and that stood for Crank, and that meant Carl Crank. Crank Lackey Development. Crank was an off-road rider who was also a very good mechanic. They were riding these special replica CZ motorcycles in the 250 classes at these races, but they didn't want anyone to know it. So anyway, that's my Brad Lackey story.
Wow.
Now
so
let me tell you.
Disguise that they were Cowies, basically. We're not.
They were trying to disguise it to some extent, although the eventually, you know, everyone caught on to it and they changed it. But that's how loose this is.
Yeah.
No one's got a factory contract. You got a handshake deal. At one point, John DeSoto's on a Kawasaki, then he's on a Suzuki, then he's on a CZ in this series. It's just going back and forth. But anyway, after this race in Indiana that Gary Bailey goes out and wins by himself, the Inter-Am starts up. And that means that the Europeans are coming over for their summer vacation. And the first race is going to be held in Boise, Idaho on June 25th. And this is where a funny thing happens. The AMA reverts back to, okay, top American is considered the winner, second place American is considered second place, third place American, third place, no matter where you finished in the actual Inter-Am. And you could very well finish 7th, 8th, 10th, whatever. But the funny thing that happens in Boise, Idaho on June 25th is that Gary Jones is not only the top American, he wins the race. He goes 1-1-1 in the three motos and beats Torsten Hallman, Dave Vickers, Gunnar Lindstrom, Stuart Nunn, Arnie Kring, Arnie Lindfors. He beats all these European guys. And now trouble starts because the second place rider, Brad Lackey, is given second place in the National. But the problem is Brad Lackey finished 7th place. Gary Jones beat him by 6 spots as far as the Inter-Am Series goes, but as far as the National Series, he only beat him by 2 spots.
Because they removed the Europeans from those results, right?
Yeah, they erased the Europeans from those results.
Yeah.
Now, you might be wondering why Lackey is not in the 500 class. It's because there is no 500 class. There's only a 500 support class because they're not counting Inter-Am races towards the National. So now what you have is a 250 National with a 500 support class within the Inter-Am Series. And here's the funny part. Guess who wins the support class?
Gary Bailey? Evel Knievel? Mike Goodwin?
Barry Higgins.
Oh. Already an age-grizzled veteran at this point.
Already an age-grizzled veteran.
Yeah.
So, in this 6-race Inter-Am Series, it'll take place on 6 consecutive weekends through late June, all of July, and early August. 2 Americans will win overalls outright. The first one's Gary Jones. The second one is Marty Tripes. Tripes, of course, does it famously at the Superbowl of Motocross. He is exactly 10 days past his 16th birthday. So he's not even legally allowed to ride that first race in Idaho. But he is allowed to ride the Superbowl of Motocross. He goes 2-2-2 and becomes the winner of what we now know as the first Supercross. The Inter-Am Series ends 6 weeks later, or rather 4 weeks later, I should say, in Lexington, Ohio. Arne Kring on a Husqvarna wins the race, but Gary Jones finishes third, and by doing that, Gary Jones has now won the Inter-Am Series outright. He is the top American and the overall winner, followed by Torsten Hallman, Arnie Kring, Torleif Hansen. The next American is Jimmy Weinert, who finishes in.
So, by the way, I was always taught, the Europeans were so superior back then. Was this insane when occasionally an American would win the race, or?
Well,
not?
here's the thing. It was pretty insane that Gary Jones would win, but missing from that race is the 250 world champion Joël Robert, who by this point is kind of focused on ending his career with just winning one more world championship. It's also missing Håkan Andersson, who is over in Europe developing what becomes the monoshock Yamaha. And it's also missing all the fast Czech riders who, the winner of the 71 Trans Am or Inter Am Series, was Vlastimil Valek on a CZ. But none of the CZ riders could get visas in 1972. So, I mean, Gary wins, but there's a little bit of an asterisk there.
Gotcha.
But nonetheless, he did beat some good guys. But Torsten Holland, by this point, is an older gentleman, and he's also helping develop the Yamaha. And the bigger deal is the Trans Am Series, and we're getting to that. Because now that the 250 Inter Am Series is over, and an American has won, now everyone's kind of loaded up and ready to see what we can do when the Trans AMA Series starts. But first, wait, hold it. There's one more standalone 250 500 National, although it really isn't a standalone National. It's another one of those infield races, and this one takes place on September 2nd in Talladega International Speedway, Talladega, Alabama. It's a 250 500 National. It probably would look and feel like what you might think Daytona would look like, and the winner is Gary Bailey. And what's cool about this, Weege, is that Gary Bailey takes 250cc National Moto-Cross on Goodyear's Eagle MX tire.
Oh, congratulations. What kind of helmet did he have?
At this point, I can't see because the photo he's riding away, and I don't know where any other photos are. But I will tell you this. Not only did Gary win the race, Gary built the track.
That didn't cause a fight, did it? I hope that didn't cause a fight.
It didn't. It did not cause a fight,
Okay.
but Gary was super plugged in at this point. So that would be the end of the 1972 AMA National Motocross Championship Series, as it were, if not for the fact that now they have the idea that if they were able to incorporate the Inter Am Series so well into the Nationals, why not go ahead and incorporate the Trans Am Series too? I mean, what could go wrong?
They're deciding this during the year? They're deciding this like right now? Hey, let's just keep going?
This appears to be a moving target. It's a flowing, moving target.
Okay.
But what happens next is no one's really thought out the fact that the first race of the Trans AMA Series is actually in Canada. and it has not only an AMA sanction, it has an FIM sanction. Because the Canadian Motorcycle Association has to have an FIM sanction in order to let all of these international stars ride. So the first round of the Trans Am Series in 1972 does not count as an AMA National. And that's fine because the Americans get smoked anyway because now the big hitters are back. And when I say big hitters, I mean Roger DeCoster, Heikki Mikkola, Aki Janssen, Arnie Kring, Hans Mischk, Ben Albert, Christer Hammergren, Miroslav Ham from Czechoslovakia, big hitters. And there are races in this series where the top American, and it's almost always Brad Lackey, finishes 6th, 8th, 6th, 8th, 8th, 4th, 6th.
Wow.
What's interesting about that is he's considered the national winner.
Yeah. Top American.
And yeah. So Canada doesn't count. That race is won by Roger DeCoster. The second race is at Honda Hills in Mid-Ohio, or not Mid-Ohio, I'm sorry, in Linville, Ohio. And anyone who's driven out Interstate 70 probably knows that Honda Hills sign is laying there, dilapidated from what was a once grand facility. But Heikki Mikkola wins the second race, followed by Hans Meschk, Roger DeCoster, Aki Janssen, Sergei Baku, and then finally you get your first American, Brian Kenny, on a Mako, and then just a bunch more Europeans. So it's really kind of jacking up the national series because the best Americans can't, they can't beat the Europeans at this point. That won't happen until 1 year later at a muddy race in Rio Bravo or maybe Lake Whitney, Texas, when Jimmy Weinert is able to win a Trans AMA round in the mud against the Europeans. And that's why, to a lot of people, Jimmy Weinert is the first American to beat the Europeans in the United States on an open-class motorcycle. And I know that's a long way to get around to, back to 1972, but that's what a big deal it was. And to take the 1972 AMA National Series and put it with the fading Inter-Am Series, that was one thing. But to put it with the Trans AMA Series was like having the Florida Winter-Ams be the lead into MXGP. It just wasn't a good fit.
So just let me get this all straight here real quick, and for the listeners as well. So the AMA Nationals start when the when the Inter-Am Series begins. They're basically both together. It's both an Inter-Am and an AMA National Championship event together.
But only for the 250 class.
Right. Oh, so then the 500s, like you said, almost feel more like a support race because of that. Yep.
And then that shoe switches feet whenever we get to the Trans Am Series, because the Trans Am Series is for 500s.
Right.
And so they stop with the 250 Nationals. And that's where, something kind of funny happens. There's no place for Gary Jones to race. So Gary Jones gets himself a 500cc Mako and joins the Trans AMA Series. And he does pretty good. And in these 11 races, or rather 10 that'll actually count, in these 10 races, Gary Jones will score enough points to finish second in the 1972 500cc AMA National Motocross Championships. So we know that Gary Jones won ostensibly 4 AMA 250cc national championships between 71 and 74, but he almost could claim the 72 500cc championship because he was ranked second at the end of it. But that would be doing a disservice to Brad Lackey, because Brad Lackey was so far out in front by this point on his Kawasaki. He never wins a Trans AMA race, but he does finish as top American, I believe, 8 out of the 11 times. So when the series is over, and by the series I mean all the AMA Nationals, the first 2 of which Lackey didn't ride, all of the U.S. Moto Cup races on the West Coast, all of the Inter-Am races, which he rode a 250 in, and then all of the Trans AMA races, Brad Lackey has 2,030 points. And if that's a mind-boggling number, you have to remember they would give 150 for a win, 120 for second, 100 for third. The second-place rider, Gary Jones, has 829 points. So Lackey has like 150% more points than the second-place guy. But if you could add Gary Jones's 250 class points, of which he had 995, it's a little more respectful. But at this point, it's easy to say that the 2 best riders in America are Brad Lackey and Gary Jones. And they have the number 1 plates to prove it, or in Gary Jones's case, the number 1 and number 2 plates to prove it.
Just not necessarily a lot of actual race wins as far as taking the checkered flag first race wins. but
no, it's a real
count?
head scratcher. But there are things that happen in this Trans Am series that just really speak to how humble and grassroots it all was. We've left a name out to this point, a Swedish rider named Åke Jansson, who'd come to visit America before on a Husqvarna. He's now riding a coffin tank Mako. He wins the last 9 races in a row, and literally everyone in America, thinks of Åke Jansson as the world champion because he completely destroys DeCoster, and he completely destroys Heikki Mikkola. But that's because he's really mad that he's never won a world championship. And DeCoster is in America practically on vacation. In fact, it was for Roger. Roger was like an ambassador of the sport. He was good at doing motocross schools, setting up other businesses. He even missed a couple Trans Am races to go to Japan and compete for the Japanese bosses. So he was only sort of half in. Mikkola, on the other hand, is kind of in it to win it, but he's not really reached the point where he would become a multi-time world champion. But the funny thing that happens to Mikkola is in between the races at Puyallup and then the drive south to the next round, which will be at Livermore, his van gets stolen. And inside Hickey's van is his 360 Husky, all of his tools, all of his spare parts, all of his riding gear. He gets so mad that he does borrow a bike to race Puyallup and actually wins a moto. But then, even though there's a couple races to go, he says the hell with it and decides to go home, back to Finland. And they put this report in Cycle News saying, this is a public service, let's see, the bike is a one-of-a-kind, so if anyone comes around trying to peddle some trick Husky parts that don't look too stock and standard for your 400 MX, nail them. Hickey's bike has engine number 4 and no frame number. He also has a spare engine number H804 and frame number H804, cylinder head, 3 or 4 pistons, and 2 rear wheels with, Goodyear MX tires. I don't know if they ever found them, but Mikkola went home.
So a championship was decided because one of the guys' vans got stolen, and that jacked up his season.
I think Åke Jansson was going to beat him anyway.
Okay.
But just as we mentioned earlier that Gary Jones is the top American in the Inter-Am Series, and he wins the Inter-Am Series, Brad Lackey is the only American who will finish in the top 10 in the Trans AMA Series. And even though guys like DeCoster and Mikkola bail early, Lackey only finishes 6th overall. But it's enough to get Brad Lackey a job in Europe in 1973, because now that the Americans are starting to prove themselves, the Japanese start thinking, why don't we send the Americans to Europe to see how good they'll do? So this is already sort of happening with Husqvarna. They've had Mark Blackwell and Billy Clements and Bob Grossi go over and race a couple races. But Brad Lackey and Jim Pomeroy for Bultaco will leave the AMA circuit, however fledgling it is, and literally go into the lion's den that is Grand Prix Motocross in 1973. And that's where things really start to change. But 1972 is the year On Any Sunday is in theaters. Honda is trying to develop its Elsinore. You've got all of the Suzuki's just starting to get involved in America. Everyone is trying to make it happen in whether it's this weird Inter-Am Series, this weird U.S. Motocross Cup Series, this Superbowl of Motocross that becomes the beginning of what we know as Supercross. But you add it all up, and you have what's quite literally a 24-race, 5 series within a series national championship. And if you don't think that's confusing, In the very last result for 1972, Saddleback Park, 500 MX, December 3rd. If you look in the vault, it says that Marty Tripes is the winner, Brad Lackey second, Gary Jones is third. And by the way, Jones is on a 500 Yamaha listed at this point. I do think it was on a Mako, but I can be corrected on that.
Probably has Goodyear tires. We know that much.
Yes, Goodyear tires. You know that those guys didn't finish there. They finished much lower than that. In fact, Tripes is the sixth-place finisher when you have the Europeans in there, and the rest of the guys fall back. But the very last entry for 1972, 14th place, is a guy named Gene Cannady, Cannady. He's an off-roader, desert racer from Canoga Park, California. He is the only guy in the race on a Honda. And he is, in fact, the first Honda rider in the vault. The first guy to score points in AMA Motocross or AMA Supercross is listed as 14th place, Gene Cannady. But the sad truth is he actually finished last place. When you take all the Europeans out, he's 14th place. You put all the Europeans in, he's 34th.
So he was 14th out of the 14 Americans that raced, which means you get 14th place. Humble debuts for Honda.
So that is the story of the 1972 AMA Motocross Championship. Like I said, it's crazy that it involves Evel Knievel, Mike Goodwin, all these funky brands from CZ to Bultaco to Mako and these new Japanese brands that are trying to make it happen. And this thing called Superbowl of Motocross that becomes, the thing that just ended, 10 days ago in Las Vegas and is now what we know as Monster Energy AMA Supercross and FIM World Championship. It's all come so far from 1972 that it's kind of incredible. The Inter-Ams are gone. The Trans-Ams are gone. Really, we have 3 series in the world now that really stand on their own. Obviously, MXGP in Europe, Supercross and Motocross here in America. But it all sort of started from that weird mashup in 1972. Not the GPs, but what we now know as Motocross and Supercross in America. And ironically, Husqvarnas were in that first series, but they didn't win. But finally, in 2018, finally, it happened.
Took many owners and many decades, and they finally made it happen. I'm sure if you quizzed most people, they would never think that what we know of as Supercross now and what we know of the Nationals actually started in the same year. It would seem like Supercross was a much newer, much more modern outgrowth of it. But the 2 series as we know them were at the exact same dates, 1972, within the months of each other.
Yeah, and you could put argument to the things being before that, but it really does all go back to Edison Dye and Torsten Hallman, and even though they may not necessarily have gotten the accolades they deserve, but there are things that Stu Peters and Dave and Bud Eakins did, and Gary Bailey, who could make an argument as the first American to beat Europeans when he won a race in '68 or '69 against some pretty good Europeans, but it was a standalone race. And then, of course, the Jones brothers, Brad Lackey, and all them. We tend to cut off everything that happened before '72 because it's not in the vault. The motocross magazines didn't exist before then. Motocross Action didn't come along till '73. And if you have a Cycle News, it's in tatters now, which is why, again, I'm so thankful for the Cycle News archives. You can go back and look this stuff up. But and even Mike Goodwin, who is now serving a double life sentence for the murder of another promoter and his wife. A whole different podcast, believe me. Yeah. And good old Barry Higgins and Sonny DeFeo, who won those first races. It's a shiny, cool object now that we can watch on live TV every weekend, whether it's a motocross race or a supercross race, and we can watch it on our phones, and the bikes are so unbelievable now, and we can stay in constant contact and connection with our favorite riders, and we just see all of this unrolling in front of our eyes. But the early days, I mean, that first Inter-Am series, in '67, it's hard to find footage of it. But if you look hard enough, if you Google Hopetown Grand Prix, you can find it, and you can see the real nuggets, the real elements of what became motocross as we know it. Even though they were calling it scrambles, it was coming, and it's really hard to find any footage from the 72 Nationals. But if you're listening and you're in front of your computer, Google 1972 Puyallup Motocross, and it's a weird spelling, like Puyallup. That is a film that someone made of the Trans Am that took place in late November, the race where Heikki Mikkola's van was stolen. Oh. And it's really well done, and it's a beautiful idea of what that series was striving to be, and couldn't be without the Inter-Am and the Trans AMA races attached to them, but what they soon became. Because finally, in 1974, and this would be a good place to sort of cap it off, finally in '74, the AMA says, you know what, let's let the Inter-Am be the Inter-Am, let's let the Trans Am be the Trans Am. Americans are winning races now, and let's focus on this new thing. Let's worry about starting a Supercross series. They called it the Yamaha Super Series of Stadium Motocross, and ironically, the first race was won by Europeans, Pierre Cars Makers and Roger DeCoster, but that became Supercross, and motocross was able to stand up on its own that same year, and within a year, the Inter-Ams were gone, and within 7 years, the Trans Ams were gone, and we were on our own, and we're still here today.
Right. That's how we end up with Supercross and the Nationals, which is what we've known for most of the history. It's actually pretty crazy when you think about how quickly so many things had to happen, from the European riders and the American riders to the European brands to Japanese brands. 3 different motocross series at one point. It's actually pretty amazing how quickly all of that got sorted out. I mean, you're only talking, 3 or 4 years before all that confusion kind of gets cleared up. The Japanese start to take over. The Americans start to win races in the United States. The multiple series thing goes away. That's actually a pretty quick evolution, considering how tangled it was when it started. Wow.
It was slow going, and when you go back and watch some old Grand Prix races, and there's a lot of good stuff online that you can look at. It really starts to take shape in '72, and it's the investment of the Japanese, or meaning in this case Suzuki, Kawasaki, and Yamaha, and then Honda soon to join, and it's starting to surpass the investment of the European brands. And the European brands, especially the Spanish brands, really start to get sideways because of political strife within their country and governments turning over. It seemed like back then there was always a new Spanish government, and Franco was going to die, and this guy was going to, that all had an effect on motorcycling, because the taxes and tariffs on the bikes would go through the roof. There was a time when 250cc motocross could have been ruled by guys riding Bultacos, Monteses, and Osas, and then all of a sudden, 75, 76, the money goes away. Same thing happens to Husqvarna in the late 70s, and the Mako company gets into a familial strife, and there's an East Germany and a West Germany, and all these things are happening, and the Japanese start to really focus on the United States of America, and that's because it's easy to get to. It's just an ocean voyage away. There's endless riding areas, and there's a market that's growing out of control because of the movie On Any Sunday, and because of the foundation laid by guys like Edison Dye and Roger DeCoster and Torsten Hallman and Gary Bailey, and and then that real eureka moment, the Super Bowl of Motocross, because that's when it really makes the turn where it's like, wow, we're going to start jumping things. We're going to turn on the lights. We're going we're going to do our own thing. And the Americans kind of went away from that European style of Grand Prix motocross and instead started focusing on our own brand of motocross. And that's a whole different story, how we kind of overtook the world in the early 80s. It was based on the money the Japanese OEMs were putting into development in America and the styles that riders like Hanna and Johnny O'Mara and David Bailey and Ken Howerton were developing here in America because they were racing Supercross. And that, I believe, would be a great second chapter to this.
And just to sum this up, the Inter-Am Series and the Trans-AMA, do they essentially get weakened because eventually the lure of, wow, the Europeans are the best in the world and I have to go watch them? Once the Americans start battling with them, is that kind of what weakens those series, and it's no longer as appealing to the Europeans, and it's also no longer as appealing to see them because now the Americans can battle with them? Is that actually what happens?
It's kind of a combination of things, but at its root, yes. And there's also the fact that because the American magazines are starting to proliferate, we're starting to build our own stars.
Gotcha.
And what's funny is the last really big star from Europe, and he was the big picture thinker, is Roger DeCoster. You know, he's a part of the 72 series because he's racing the Trans Am series, but DeCoster builds an affection for American motocross that will see him be sort of the last guy to keep racing the Trans Ams and racing as the generational shift really starts to happen with Bob Hanna and Marty Smith. DeCoster stays in the ring and fights those guys and is still beating them, you know, in 78 and into 79. And when he retires in 1980 as a Grand Prix racer, he takes a job in America with Team Honda, and all of a sudden we win the Motocross of Nations. There were a lot of things that led up to that, but yes, the change takes place between 72 and 81. You could sum it up by saying that the balance of power in global motocross moves from Europe to America with a big assist from the Inter-Am and Trans Am series, and specifically from guys like Roger DeCoster, Heike Mikkola, Garrett Wolsink, you know, all those guys that we know as Trans Am stars. And, you know, give credit to Brad Lackey and Jim Pomeroy from going over and getting their asses kicked for years, and then coming back and teaching our guys how to ride in the fall. And, you know, they're also influential. The sad part about Lackey and Jones, Lackey and Pomeroy is Pomeroy, first American to win a Grand Prix. You know, may he rest in peace. Tragically, he was killed in an automobile accident about a dozen years ago. And Lackey stays in Europe on a crusade for 10 years, and finally, in 1982, becomes the FIM World Champion. And that's his career goal. It's his lifetime goal. But both Lackey and Pomeroy probably left dozens of national wins on the table, probably left Supercross wins on the table, probably left titles on the table. We'd be talking about them right up there with Hanna if they hadn't spent the vast majority of their best years racing in Europe. But they did it sort of in a service to the riders that would follow. They went over and learned how to ride, and they brought it back. And it's sad that there's no real championships for them other than that very first one for Lackey and that world championship for Brad. But for Pomeroy, it just doesn't exist. But he made sacrifices, and we're all better for it.
Yeah, because he appears to be, in this first 72 year, Lackey is the best American rider. But if you go through records and what would be considered Mount Rushmore, we're always basing on the championships we know now, which is Supercross titles and race wins and national titles and race wins. That wasn't what he was doing, and he only got the one world championship. So it's not like he's up to, say, DeCoster's level or Everett's level on the world scene. So he gets left in the cracks, unfortunately, a little bit.
Yeah. And we can close out with this. We're on the 30 greatest AMA motocrossers right now, and, probably pretty easy to see how that's going to wrap up. There is a GOAT out there. There's no question about that.
Yeah.
But if you added in what guys did in Europe or what Europeans did in America, surely there would be a place for Brad Lackey on that list. and surely there'd be a place for Roger DeCoster, because Roger DeCoster, in the end, would win one Supercross race, which was the Superbowl of Motocross, the Daytona Supercross in 1975. But he would also win 27 Trans Am races over the course of his career, and 4 championships. Those don't count in that list, but if they did, DeCoster would be on the Mount Rushmore of American motocross, and so would Lackey. They would be up there with the GOAT and a few other guys, Hanna, McGrath, but they'd be up there, and it'd be pretty cool to see.
Now, you do have to answer one more thing before we're done here.
Sure.
Does Evel Knievel pay $1 million? Does this happen? Does the forerunner to the Monster Energy
if you look very closely, on the ad, and you have to look very closely on everything that Evel did.
Okay.
It says in cash, comma, prizes, comma,
oh, no.
contingency, comma, and more.
And more.
But to his credit, in 1974, when Evel Knievel finally gets around to trying to jump the Snake River Canyon, he does offer a $125,000 purse for a standalone race. And it's not till the U.S. Open of Supercross comes along that someone gives a better purse than that for a single race in the United States. Of course, the Snake River Canyon jump was a complete fiasco, and the American public never really trusted Knievel again, and he went from being everyone's favorite crazy uncle to being sort of this hapless daredevil in a Elvis outfit, and a bitter man, toward the end of his life too. Although he would have a renaissance when the X Games came along, and people started to appreciate what he did a little more. He was a con man, and he was a piece of work at times. But man, could he promote. Goodwin may be in jail and Evel may be halfway between heaven and hell. But he did a lot, and he meant to do a lot, and he lived bigger than life, and he did. He kept his word in '74 and paid that $125,000, but he didn't really get to do another big jump again.
Hey, do you see full circle here? Our not the halfway between heaven and hell part, but the modern day Evel Knievel, as far as just known for doing crazy things on a motorcycle. We're going to make this go really full circle. So Travis Pastrana is going to try to reenact some of the evilness. This just came out today.
I saw that, and you know what? If I'm not doing any, I think it's July 8th, and unfortunately there's a race in Michigan I'm going to be at.
Yeah.
Or I'd be there. I'd be there with a plastic cup full of what Evel drank whenever I got to sit and talk with him.
Okay.
And that was O'Doul's and a shot of wild turkey. Of course, he was drinking on someone else's liver at that point. But anyway, I wish Travis luck in that. And if Travis is stuck with motocross, there might be a place for him up there on that Rushmore too. But I wish him luck in this. And yeah, if anyone can do it, it's Travis Pastrana.
This is crazy. Okay, Hangtown. That's coming up. I don't know how you squeezed out an hour and 15 minutes to talk old school. We've got a pretty big thing coming up here in a few days.
Yeah, and I can't wait. And there won't be, I know that Brad Lackey is going to be the Grand Marshal of the event and the guest of honor. And I can't wait to go shake his hand and just be like, Brad, I've known Brad since, I think my dad introduced me to him in 74 or 73 maybe. And I was just a little kid. My favorite rider was Heikki Mikkola, who was his teammate for a while. I never really appreciated all of what Brad did. I certainly appreciated his crusade that took a decade to win the World Championship, but I didn't realize what a badass he was in 71 and 72. And the fact that he'd sign up on a CZ but ride a Kawasaki but sell CZs at a shop and keep up with the Europeans. That's good stuff. I'm impressed, and I can't wait to tell him I really know a lot more now. Someone needs to write a book about Brad Lackey. I don't have time, but maybe Eric Johnson does.
Yeah, so there you go. We'll just get the pros on it. We'll get EJ on that one. So that's really cool that Brad will actually be there. we're young enough in this sport where most of our heroes are still around, so it's good to get these stories in when we can. I'll try to chat him up a bit. Grand Marshal, that's a pretty cool deal. Hangtown coming up. We know that you want a bench race about the future. Now you already know the past. Pretty crazy how it all started. Thanks to Davey for the time on the phone. And thanks to the folks at Yoshimura, of course, for backing this podcast. Check them out. Yoshimura-rd.com. Got the cool exhaust system. It's going to be out on the track. We'll see how those Yoshimura Auto Trader Suzukis look out there. And the Geico Hondas, they're going to be looking good and probably sounding good as well. RacerXbrand.com for all your cool looks. Racer X Illustrated, the magazine, still worth subscribing to. These will be historical documents someday as well, just like those old Cycle News archives. So get the magazine now. It's cheap, bro. $20 a year for 12 printed issues or 10 for the digital edition. Totally different stuff than we have here online. I just finished a Jason Anderson story for the latest issue that's coming out now. I'll be working on an Eli Tomac story this weekend that will be exclusive to the magazine, not on the website. And also, hey, I'm announcing these races on TV. I get to be reunited with my buddy Grant Langston. Can't wait. Talked to him quite a bit over the last couple weeks to get ready for this. We have a new pit reporter, Will Christian. Sayonara to Georgia Lindsay. Loved working with her. She has chosen to stay back in jolly old England this year. But hopefully I'll bump into her at some point somewhere. It was always great working with her. So that's it. We'll see you at Hangtown. We've talked enough about the past. We'll see you in the near future, which will be the present, on Saturday afternoon, just outside of Sacramento. Thanks for listening to the Racer X Exhaust Podcast. See you next week.